Hello and welcome to the Roar of Love podcast. I am your host, Dr. Heléna Kate, and today we're going to be talking about love, expansion, and the courage to remain yourself. Specifically, how to tell if a relationship is making you smaller. So today we're going to be taking a look at what the dynamics of a relationship are that help you expand, grow, be more of yourself, or do the opposite. So how do you know if a relationship is making you smaller? And perhaps, like, even more importantly, how do you know if you're making yourself smaller in a relationship? Because relationships have an incredible ability to reveal us to ourselves. So sometimes they show us where we're loved. Sometimes they show us where we're wounded. Sometimes they show us where we're growing. And sometimes they reveal to us places that we've been quietly abandoning ourselves, maybe for a long time, maybe for decades or since childhood. So, when I'm talking about relationships, I'm not necessarily talking just about romantic relationships. So, of course, romantic relationships are one of the most powerful mirrors that we can encounter. But I also want to broaden that conversation to talk about friendships, family relationships, spiritual communities, professional relationships, our relationship with our purpose, our relationship with our gift, our relationships with the divine, even our relationship with life itself. Because ultimately, all of life, every aspect of life exists in relationship. We have relationships with all of it. So the way that we relate to one thing is often the way we relate to all things. And so we can learn a lot from every area of our life that we look into. Every aspect of our life that we look into, we can see a microcosm or a template or a system or some way that like some configuration that allows us to see, oh, wait a second here. So when I started years ago, I started talking about the relationship with the divine, and I started teaching it through what we understand about relationships, both the functional and the uplifting and the dysfunctional, and using that language to help people understand how they could develop a relationship with the divine that felt more alive, more personal, more dynamic, and to see where maybe some of the problems in that relationship with spirit actually were replicated, or they could see in their personal relationships. Now, this is not to over extrapolate and say that everything that is here is everything that is over here, but that we can use an ever shifting lens to understand more about ourselves. And that just winds up being helpful. That winds up really helping us be able to see more deeply into different aspects of our life. So what I found over the years of working with people is that very often when someone feels stuck, frustrated, exhausted, disconnected, lost, there's usually somewhere a relationship dynamic that can be examined. And so today we're going to look more deeply at what it means to become smaller in relationship, what the signs of contraction are overall, what the difference is between growth and diminishment, our personal responsibility inside of all of it, toxicity versus incompatibility, and how relationships can become our spiritual teachers. Because as I'm saying, like, this is all is relationship, and we have this an unending way that we can explore deeper into our spiritual understanding through the study of relationship. So most people don't start from a place of, I think I'd like to abandon myself today. I think I'd like to make myself smaller today, right? That's not usually where we get started. It's gradual or it's unconscious, right? So, and it can be both. Right? That we might not say like make a grand step in that direction. We might just not say something, right? Or you might let something that really bothers us slide. We might decide that something isn't really worth bringing up. Or you might convince yourself that you're being, kind or compassionate or understanding or flexible, right? You might say that you're being spiritual. Right. All of these things are kind of the ways that we rationalize or justify what it is that's going on. And then we might at one point in time realize, like, look around and take a look at ourselves inside, outside, and realize that we're not really being fully present in our own life. That somehow we've become a smaller version of ourselves. And it's not necessarily because we were forced in some way. It's because that contraction happens maybe one little step at a time. This is something that people often talk about in long-term romantic relationships. That they woke up one day, more or less, right? And said, wait a second, I'm not myself anymore, or I don't know who I am anymore. And I don't feel like myself in the relationship. And this is sometimes the reason that people have affairs. This is sometimes the reason that people leave their relationship because they want to break out. They want to be their full self. They want to be able to express or be more of themselves in their life and in their relationship. And so one of the tricks often in this is helping people to be able to recall those parts of themselves and maintain the relationships that are important to them. That is not always possible, but sometimes it's more possible than people think it is. Because the reasons for the contraction, the reasons for those regular compromises, like it's those patterns that are actually a problem. And that when not corrected, the problem just gets replicated in another area. And when corrected, it can sometimes make a radical difference in the relationship where those problems are showing up. So very often, we're caught in this place where we don't quite understand, which we'll talk about a little bit more, the difference between healthy compromise and true, like actually abandoning ourselves, or what is like being supportive, or really just being like a good-natured, keeping the pace, compassionate, understanding person. And when we are crossing a line for ourselves. And of course, we always want to belong. We want to maintain connection, especially for many women. They really are very much geared on all levels, biologically and otherwise, to maintain a sense of belonging. So one of the things that people can sometimes mistake here is that this adaptation, their adaptation to situations, their compromises, or they're making themselves smaller. Let's differentiate here. They're making themselves smaller. They actually might mistake that for a form of maturity. So we're going to break this down a little bit more. So the first thing is, what does it mean to become smaller? Like how do we do that? Or what does that mean in relationship? So a relationship makes us smaller when we feel less alive in it, right? Or we understand this, our limitation, or we start to feel smaller, and because we're feeling less alive in a relationship. So now there's a difference here, right? I didn't say when we feel challenged. Right? It's not that we feel challenged in a relationship or someone disagrees with us in a relationship, because challenge is not really the problem. It's like the growth can also be like very good, very expansive relationships can often be uncomfortable at times. We can find that in our relationship to ourselves and our own personal growth. We can find that in relationship with others. So challenge is not feeling less alive, right? But the like, is it like really, it's, am I becoming more of myself, right? So a good relationship will challenge us, a good teacher will challenge us, a meaningful spiritual path will challenge us. And in the result of it is where I am becoming more fully myself. And this isn't as easily discernible because when we change, we might question whether or not we are becoming more fully ourselves or whether we're just simply becoming something different. So there's some complexity to working with this. But when we are becoming less of ourselves, some of the things that we might see are things like we stop sharing our ideas, we stop expressing our needs, we might stop pursuing our dreams. We might stop trusting ourselves, are taking appropriate risks, becoming increasingly cautious or guarded, right? Those might all be signs that we are actually making ourselves smaller and that we're managing ourselves rather than living our life or expressing ourselves. And so overall, our life starts to lose its color, its finesse, its nuance, its quality of us. And so we want to start to become aware of this, that like this withdrawal of self is always a reason to explore and to say, what's happening here? Is this actually an adaptation or a growth that I'm changing? I'm like, I'm going to keep my ideas to myself a little bit because in keeping my ideas to myself, that'll actually like, I'm going to work on them a bit more before I share them. That might be growth and that might be an expansion of the self. But when you just don't feel that you can talk about what's important to you or that you're not interested in sharing your ideas, that might be a sign that maybe there's a contraction that's less helpful that is in the mix. So there can be lots of different things that are happening kind of like in this place. But one of the things that we know is that this aliveness is a good indicator of our health, our vitality, our overall well-being. And it is, so we want to care for this, right? We're using aliveness right now, but we could use lots of other words in order to talk about this. So we want to take a look and say, okay, like this is one of the things that I most need to care for in my life is the deeper truth of myself and my capacity to live that. Why? Because that's like kind of our primary responsibility before we expand outside of that to other things. So we are this is a very important thing for us to care for, and because this vitality and it's like in our authenticity are very linked together. In other words, we can't truly be vital in life if we're not living authentically. And so we want to, it's very important that our relationships in our life are set up to support this vitality, this authenticity, this aliveness. So one of the foundational ideas that I work with is that like relationships reveal us, right? So they don't create everything that we experience. They help reveal things about us, right? Relationships help reveal our attachment patterns, our fears, our expectations, our unmet needs, our strengths, our capacity to love, right? And because of that, they are extraordinary opportunities for growth. And so they're not just happening to us. That's a really important point of discernment, that relationships are not just happening to us. We can feel like that, but we're in a process of co-creation where they are teaching us. And so that reframe starts to shift a lot of problematic dynamics. So as we're talking about, it's very important to get out front when we're talking about relationships, either helping you expand or make you smaller, because it's very easy for the conversation to start to slide into, and this relationship is doing this to me, instead of this relationship is providing me with an opportunity to see something. Yes, about the other person. Yes, about the relationship, but primarily about myself, right? So that we move beyond blame, because blame is usually not transformative, but our curiosity about what it is that's being shown to us can be deeply transformative. So, very often, most difficult people in our lives, and sometimes those are family members, can become our most profound teachers. So, so we find these areas of difficulty in our life, and they are like these people that are difficult in our life, sometimes persistently difficult in our life, and they can teach us so much. That is not to say that we want to prolong an unhealthy dynamic so that it teaches us, right? We simply want to learn everything that we need to learn and either transmute the relationship by it while being in it, or transmute it by not being in it. But to recognize that that is an important component, that sometimes these difficult people, we don't have to be like, why are they doing this to me? Instead, we can say, oh, what do I have to learn here? And our growth potentiates, it accelerates as a result of it. Because that's how relationships can become part of one of the ways. Relationships can become part of our spiritual curriculum. So we get to see the triggers of a relationship as information. And then this actually helps us move from victimhood into inquiry. And this is a very powerful shift that we can make. So the triggers become information, and then we get to move from victimhood into deeper inquiry of the nature of what's happening. So how do we participate in our own shrinking, right? How do we participate in the diminishment of ourself? And this is where things can get really interesting. Because clearly, as I've been setting things up, every experience of becoming smaller is not caused by the other person. Because very often we're doing it to ourselves. It's actually a good place to start. So if we're honest about it, it's probably more common than most of us want to admit, right? Because we don't want to say like, oh, I'm choosing to be small. Because very often nobody asks us to shrink. Or if they do ask us to shrink, then we're complicit in that process. So very often it's like nobody's asked us to be quiet. They haven't asked us to suppress ourselves. We simply learned somewhere along the way that in order to be connected, we need to abandon ourselves. And very often we learn that in childhood. And then maybe we learned that again through heartbreak, or through rejection, or through criticism. And so we enter a relationship already prepared to be smaller, to be less of ourselves in order to get along. So very often people who are doing this, they might have all sorts of feelings about it, but they're doing it to love and be loved. They're willing to compromise themselves in the hopes of being able to love. And one of the things that helps us get us this is like, what am I afraid would happen if I fully became myself? That's a really good question. If you have an opportunity, it's a good one to write down. What am I afraid would happen if I became fully myself in this particular relationship? And that question reveals a lot to us about what it is that we're afraid of, right? Rejection, success, being seen, outgrowing people. All of those things are things that we might be afraid of. And so when we start to see what it is that we're avoiding, then we start to be able to make choices, to face our fears, and to stand in our full self in the world, in that relationship. Or in some cases to leave that relationship, because it's not all situations are supportive of our being our full self. We just want to address our patterns, our presumptions, our projections in the situation, our assumption that this is going to happen as a result of my being myself, that operates unconsciously, so that we remove that piece of it. And then we might look at the relationship being like, yes, actually this person does want to keep me smaller, or this person does actually want to make sure that I'm not successful, because sometimes people don't have our best interest at heart. But sometimes we clear those projections or those assumptions, and we are actually start to see that another relationship is possible. One of the things that can come up as we navigate this terrain is whether, kind of what the roles of our personal responsibility, like I said, looking at ourselves, understanding what our role is inside of all of it, or really, is this a toxic relationship? Is this relationship mistreating me? And is it making it so that, like, even if I were to start communicating and I was to start expressing myself, that there would be an surmountable, amount of problems that would come from that person be outright oppositional to that movement forward, right? Or is it just a mismatch? Because very often that gets overlooked inside of everything, where we look at either you're responsible and then we start to downplay the toxicity of of relationships, which there are toxic relationships, or we emphasize, oh, it's everybody else's fault. That person is toxic. That situation is toxic, and we take out our personal responsibility. We're very often in working between those two pieces and in an imbalanced way. But what we talk about less is sometimes there's just simply an energetic mismatch. Not everything works together. Not every situation or all energies are aligned and congruent with each other. Sometimes we just have to acknowledge the fact that, it just doesn't work for some reason. So let's kind of take a look at this. Let's look at the distinctions between when we're feeling smaller in a relationship. Let's look at the distinctions between, are we creating the dynamic? Is this a toxic relationship, or are we simply incompatible? Because each of these are different situations. So sometimes we're waiting for permission that nobody actually ever withheld. And we're assuming rejection that's never occurred. And we're protecting ourselves from a conversation that will never happen, or that, we haven't had. So in these kind of situations, the relationship might not really be the problem, right? Our fear might actually be the problem. And sometimes we don't know until we speak up or show up or become visible or tell the truth or take up space. Because it's only through doing that we actually see what happens. Now, just if we were to speak up or show up or tell the truth or something like that, to assume that the other person is the problem, that it's a toxic situation, for example, simply because that person reacts negatively or isn't able to receive what it is that's going on, isn't actually getting far enough. We haven't gone far enough with it, especially if we're just trying to maneuver these relational dynamics differently. And why is that? Because we're probably not so great at expressing ourselves. So it's probably a little less refined, and we might be bringing some baggage along with what we're doing. Or the other person might just be responding to change. And people don't necessarily easily respond to change. Like a person, if you've been acting one way for 10 years, and then all of a sudden you mix that up and you change the way that you're acting overnight out of the blue, the person might not be able to accommodate that. They might not be able to adjust instantaneously. And this is where we need to give grace to ourselves and others. We need to refine our own approach in starting to do those things. And we also need to give some time and space for other people to be able to adjust to the new way that we're putting ourselves forward. And this takes a lot of give and take. It takes some patience and understanding, but we learn a lot through that. And really, the criteria at this point in time, a lot of time comes down to what is sustainable for each party during this time. It doesn't necessarily have to do with, is the relationship toxic or not toxic? Because more often it has to do with capacity of each person during that time of change. And so there's a lot to figure out and understand inside of that. And this is a really good place to get help from an outside person. So this is a really good place to get help from an advisor or a therapist, or will help you be able to navigate, because you can't quickly move through it. You need to learn the nuance of this to develop more depth inside of your relationships. So there's a lot of learning. It won't be perfect. And you don't have to worry. Perfection is not actually necessary. So sometimes we do speak or communicate or show up, and our growth is really consistently punished, right? And so that's a clarity. So when there's active punishment or manipulation, retaliation, things like that, those are really good indicators that you're in something that's at least unhealthy for that moment. So if your growth is consistently punished, if your success consistently creates resentment, if your boundaries are met with manipulation, if your honesty is going to create retaliation, if your self-expression creates criticism, right? So then this might be a place to say, maybe there's some great things that are going on. Again, this is different by a healthy relationship that might be challenged by your growth, but that is not threatened by your growth. And so really we're talking about a continuum where challenge is on one side of it and threat is on another. And we kind of want to know when we go too far and the relationship starts really being something that is restrictive, right? So we want to start to become clearer about what emotional manipulation looks like, what is punishment versus discomfort, motivation, why somebody might want to keep us small, and distinguishing certain types of support from control. All of these things are going to be really helpful overall for us to start to be able to kind of like tease those out, or be able to see the dynamics that are at play inside of those finer tuned understandings. And that helps us really be able to see whether we're dealing with something that is just having growth pains, or is truly an unhealthy dynamic. And so again, relationship is challenging. Relationship like stretches and grows us. And so it very often can push us into places where we're uncomfortable. And we really want to know where the line of harm is. And that is actually different for different people. And it's also different for different people at different times. So meaning someone might have the capacity to deal with that at a certain point in time, and actually have less of a capacity at another point in time. Like say somebody's going through a period where they're emotionally unstable, like they lost a loved one or something like that, they might have less of a capacity to show up or to deal with the growing pains of someone else in their life related to their truthful expression, for example. So those are situations where there's like overlaps from different domains of our life. And we start to say, okay, like, I might be able to deal with that in a different situation, but right now I actually don't have the capacity because some of my bandwidth is taken up with grief, for example. So we want to start to learn about that. And this third category, right, is about simply a mismatch. And so this is most often, as I was saying, the most overlooked possibility, right? And maybe nobody's wrong. Maybe nobody is toxic. Maybe nobody is bad. Maybe it's not a fit that works. People will say oil and water, right? And so, I like to think of the elements in this particular situation, right? Like you can have the wind can help to build a fire or it can help to put it out. It can create a wildfire, or it can help to create a campfire, or it can extinguish the flame altogether. That's just some of the potential relationships that are there. So if you have too much of something, and even though it might help in certain circumstances, it might actually become problematic if it's not in right relationship. Or some things are just really, like, they really don't go together most of the time. Like the vast majority of the time, cats don't like to be in water. There are some cats that like to swim. It's rare, but it is something, right? So we want to start to understand that sometimes things just don't fit together. Sometimes a person just in being themselves activates a part of you that is like, it isn't going to effectively grow through that activation. It's actually just creates like a negative feedback or a bouncing back and forth. If people want to try enough, many things can be overcome. But there's often a point where people reach and they say, like, this is just kind of how I feel natural and comfortable in my life. And this is how you feel natural and comfortable in your life. And if we were to make the changes that are needed for our to be comfortable with each other, both of us would be uncomfortable or one of us would be uncomfortable. And that's a good example of a mismatch. Like for another way of saying this would be like one person wants growth and exploration and another person wants, predictability, right? One might value emotional processing and the other person might really value emotional simplicity. Right. And so that often happens in relationship. One person is wanting to express themselves and the other person is like, whoa, wait a second here. Like, I don't like that, and it's not that either person is wrong. It's that they have different styles. And so unless they can find a common ground together, then it winds up being a mismatch. Right. So they might not want to maintain like an intensive relationship, like a romantic partnership, because it might actually create more of a problem. And when we try instead to solve this problem, right? When sometimes people will be like, oh, but I really love you and I would like to be able to solve this particular mismatch. And like I said, that is fine to the point where both people are able to like happily coexist inside of the change. And at the point where one person is like truly compromised, then it just doesn't really work. So this is one of the reasons why sometimes the expression love isn't always enough, because you can love somebody and truly appreciate everything about them and not necessarily be compatible with who they are. And so in that, you just acknowledge the fact that like, wow, I love you. You're an amazing person. And actually like trying to do this with you isn't effective. Like not everybody is a good work partner. Not everybody is a good romantic partner, even though they might be a great person. And this also kind of highlights sometimes when people are looking at things like compatibility versus chemistry. They might be really drawn to a person. There might be a really powerful physical dynamic, but that there actually isn't compatibility there. You don't get along with the other person. And so after the kind of chemicals die down, they're not as intense like at the beginning of a romantic relationship, then people are kind of faced with are we actually compatible with each other? So it's like if you're looking for a long-term relationship, it actually is usually helpful to emphasize the understanding of compatibility, to explore compatibility in the lead and have chemistry actually come in to support that. They're both important, but the compatibility is the thing that is going to have the most staying power. And it will either support ongoing chemistry or it'll take it out. So that's another in looking at whether or not you're like matched with someone. So another piece of it that has to do with like mismatches a lot of times is values. Very, very often when people's values are mismatched, even if they respect each other and they love each other, they can really struggle because they keep running into this place where they want to have a shared value, but they don't actually have a shared value, meaning the nature of the relationship moves them in the direction of wanting to have a shared value, but they actually don't. Some people can hold this with more grace than others, and some mismatches or differences are not necessarily mismatches. And in this, it's very important to recognize that the person isn't wrong. Very often when there's a mismatch, one of the go-to things that a person will do because of their pain, actually, their difficulty in dealing with the situation, is they want to find something wrong. They want to find something wrong with the person. It's actually easier to find something wrong and to say this just won't work than just acknowledging the realities of there being a mismatch. But when we go there, sometimes we can just, when we acknowledge the mismatch, sometimes we can just shift the relationship and actually move into a relationship that really is served by the characteristics of each of the people, instead of just leaving it completely. So why is it here, if you haven't guessed already, like what makes relationships such powerful spiritual teachers, right? And it's partly is because they constantly confront our illusion of separation, right? They're always asking us in some way, can you remain yourself while staying connected? And this is like one of our deeper spiritual connections. So many people know how to be themselves by being in isolation, and they know how to connect by abandoning themselves. So what happens is when we're able to fully hold our true self and connect, then we start to create something really beautiful. And this is what we might call more mature. So I want to, before we wrap up for today, I want to broaden the lens a little bit, because I've been a lot of times using the examples of relationships, and even more like a lot of times romantic relationships, partners, kind of one-on-one dynamics, right? But you can become smaller in your relationship with anything. So, and here's some things to think about. Like with work, right? Do you feel alive in your work or diminished? With your purpose, do your dreams expand you or do they frighten you into contraction? Does your spiritual practice make you more honest or avoidant, right? Can you belong in community without disappearing? Do you experience God, spirit, or source as something that invites your fullest expression, right? And then we might start to see that there's commonalities across different dimensions of our life about how we feel. And that first might be, oh, yeah, I do see how I like this contraction. is happening in different dimensions. Then we might go deeper with it and start to see the patterns that are around that, and these patterns that repeat across our life, and start to show us, oh, wait a second here, this is where I bought into the story of restriction, or bought into this is how and why I need or want, I need to be smaller. And when we do that, when we kind of buy into that story, it very often shows up across many areas of our life. So, expansiveness, on the other hand, what does the expansiveness of a relationship feel like? It doesn't always feel easy, but they do feel alive. So, in an expansive relationship, some science might be that you tell the truth more often. You actually trust yourself more deeply as a result. You feel safer being your authentic self. You continue growing. You're more creative and you become more capable. So basically, the relationship becomes a greenhouse, right? Instead of a cage. Your growth is supported, perhaps even amplified. Life expands. Love becomes larger. We become more as a result of it, even if it's accompanied with challenge. But we see that through whatever it is that is there, we are actually becoming more. And even better, that we see that there's a mutual evolution that's going on. So there's all sorts to explore inside of this potential. What kind of skills we might need to develop there, what might actually create an environment that's supportive of our expansion, or how we might create that environment for ourselves or for others. And we get to see that, there are ways that we can actively participate in the growth, development, and expansion through relationship. Just as there are ways that we can consciously or unconsciously live our diminishment or the diminishment of others. In closing, perhaps ask this question: does this relationship love me? Who am I becoming in this relationship? Are you becoming more alive, more courageous, more honest, more authentic, more connected, more capable of love? Or are you becoming increasingly disconnected from your own truth? Relationships aren't just places where we receive love, they're places where we discover ourselves. And perhaps one of the most loving things that we can do, one of the greatest acts of love, is our ability to remain fully ourselves and to stand in genuine connection with others, because love doesn't ask us to disappear. It asks us to be. So I want to thank you for joining me today on Roar of Love. And if today's conversation resonated with you, I invite you to spend some time reflecting on your relationships, your life, and asking yourself where you feel expanded, where you feel contracted, and what those relationships might be trying to teach you. Until next time, stay open, stay true, and keep answering love's call.
Thank you for listening to the Roar of Love podcast. If today's episode spoke to you, visit Sacred Lights at sacredlights.com for more insights and guidance on your journey. Until next time, stay open, stay true, and keep answering love's call.